rail. Now, I am delighted to have with us today 3 scholars of note. Mr. Thomas Cornet is an independent scholar whose research focuses on issues concerning railways and public transportation in the United States. His research on planning, policy, engineering, and management issues has been published in a variety of transportation and law journals. Dr. Robert Gallimore is a nationally known expert in railroad economics with a distinguished career, including director of the Transportation Center and professor of managerial economics and decision sciences at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. He is the author of Railroads, Decline and Renaissance in the 20th Century. Mr. Christian Wolmar is a regular writer, award-winning for numerous newspapers, including The Times, The Guardian, and The Spectator, with a fortnightly column in Rail for nearly 3 decades. Author of numerous books, including The Great Railroad Revolution, The History of Trains in America, Engines of War, To the Edge of the World, Railways and the Raj, and more. I am the moderator, the Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars, David Randall. Now, I will say first off, more of the books by our authors will appear in the chat button below in a little bit. Therefore, you will have the chance to see, to buy everything they have written. Please take advantage. The prompt for today's discussion is, how did the railroad transform American transportation? How were railroads and locomotives viewed in the popular imagination at the time of their creation? Who were key figures responsible for developing the rail lines and trains that came into widespread use? And what forces led to the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad? Now, the format. We will have 3 conversational talks, maybe 12 to 14 minutes each. And the order, I believe, will be Robert Gallimore, Christian Wolmar, Thomas Cornet. Once they have finished their talks, then you, the audience, get to do your Q&A. Please put questions into either the chat or the Q&A buttons at the bottom. I will relay them, or they can be read by the participants directly. When I relay them, I do them in whatever order makes it for a good conversation, not chronological. If your question is not answered by the end of the session, please send email to me, randall@nas.org, and I will be delighted to convey your questions to the participants so they can have the opportunity to answer you. So do not worry, your question will get answered, if not now, after the session. Also, if you have to run from here or just want to pass on news of this to your friends, family, enemies, this will be recorded on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours and available for perpetuity. So no, don't worry if you have to leave. Having said all that, I'd be delighted to start with Dr. Robert Gallimore.
Okay. Now I need to get you into this presentation, and I can do that if I can share my screen, I believe. Well.
Yes, you had it right there at the beginning. I just turned it off so that David could finish his introduction. So if you could just repeat that step.
All right.
Click the green button down.
Let me go back. This is my book on which I'm going to rely. I jointly wrote this with John R. Meyer, a distinguished transportation economist, author of one of the premier textbooks in the field of transportation economics, and my mentor at Harvard.
Dear Robert, may you click the green button down at the bottom of your screen, or the Zoom window, because you're currently not sharing it.
I'm not. So how do I do that? Nope. I do not know how to share again.
If you go back to your Zoom window, and down at the bottom, there's a big
It
green
should
button.
be, but I'm not seeing it. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so no.
Click on it. Try clicking
Click on which?
just on your screen, and it might pop up. Or move your cursor.
Here's my share button.
Ah,
Did that work?
share screen.
Right. Within the Zoom webinar window, at the bottom of that particular window, there is a green icon saying share screen with a rectangle and an upward pointing arrow.
Well, why isn't this working now?
Well, if not, if we can just continue without it, that's okay. But
Well, slideshow. Does that come through?
Sadly, no. No, as I say, if you can't find the share screen button, I think it's just best to continue.
Okay. I don't know why there's no share screen on this page, but let's see if I can do it from this screen. Does it share?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, well, I don't know how you'll be able to follow this without me sharing it. So I don't know. Well, what I need to do for you is walk through these slides, and I'll try not to read them, but if you can imagine what they are like, that will be a big help. And then you can go back later and ask questions, or I can speak offline with you.
Robert, as an alternative, how about you email me your slideshow and we like Christian going ahead?
Yeah, I
And
could
I can share it for you. Would that
Okay.
work?
Sure.
I could go first.
Okay, great. And Robert, just email me those leighton@nas.org. Should already be in your inbox.
I'm sorry, I don't understand, but go ahead.
Okay. Shall I start, David?
Yes, please.
Okay. Slightly rushed because I didn't expect to go first, but that's fine. I thought what I would do is to provide 10 or so, depending how much time I get, examples where railways really changed America. I've written a series of history books covering a range of subjects, from the Trans-Siberian Railway, railways in India, railways in America, which is the one I'm talking about here, British Railways, the underground, the subway system in the UK, and so on. And if there was a kind of theme running through all my work, is really that the railways were transformational, that they were a catalyst for the development of capitalism in the 19th century, and that their role has to some extent been forgotten about. And so that's why I welcome kind of giving talks like this, because it enables me to stress the point that, you know, the railways were the most important invention of the 19th century, and their impact was multifaceted. In fact, if you can play a game whereby you can try to work out what things did the railway not influence, and it's quite difficult to find things that were not changed by the advent of the railways. So, and there's a kind of parallel between the UK railways and the American railways. in both cases, the first line was in 1830. In both cases, there was a very kind of rapid spread. There was a real boom. And even though America was behind the UK in terms of development at the time, the railways were an absolute driving force for change in both countries. So the first thing, what was the first thing they did? Well, they created a transport system. And they created a transport system that was different from anything previously. So both the UK and the US had some canals. There was some canal transport. There was rivers, particularly in the US, were used for early transport. But essentially, nobody had ever traveled in the US faster than they could ride a horse. And the railways changed all that and changed it remarkably quickly. And the first railway is the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, where, interestingly enough, there was a contest between the railway engine and a horse. And actually, the railway engine won the first leg, and then the horse actually won the second one because the railway engine blew up. But fortunately, the Baltimore and Ohio decided that horse-drawn transport was not the future and went with the engine. And one of the things about interesting about American history is that actually the Baltimore and Ohio is very famous and well known, and in fact survived until the 1980s. But actually the biggest development, early development, was in the South with what was known as the Charleston and Hamburg, but properly it's the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company, which also began operating in 1830. And by 1833, it had 130 miles long. So an amazing achievement. And it took the Baltimore and Ohio many years to get that long. And yet it's been virtually completely forgotten about. And that's one of the kind of interesting aspects of railroad history, is that all sorts of amazing things have virtually been forgotten about. Again, something that I try and bring out in my books. Secondly, the second important thing is the importance of government. The railways were really the first major national development, again, both in the UK and the US, that required government support. And it's a myth to think this was all private enterprise. It required help from the government, sometimes in terms of grants, sometimes in terms of land gifts, also in terms of legislation, allowing railways eminent domain, in other words, control over the area they wanted to build the railways, and so on. And so this was very much what we now call a sort of public private partnership. It was government with the railways, but the government playing an absolutely crucial role in the development, and something again that has been forgotten. Thirdly, we have the kind of dreams that the railways put out. They promoted themselves. I love the story that I cite in my book of the promoter who goes to some little town and says, "You need the railway. It's going to kind of bring you prosperity. It's going to enable you to sell your crops kind of more easily. It's going to help with education, help with literacy." And in a way, they were snake oil salesmen, because very often the railways did not emerge and they were con men or whatever. But very often they were right. The railways did actually bring all these aspects. They did enable people to be more educated. They did encourage a whole different form of society than had gone before. And so that brings us rightly on to the next aspects, which is technological progress. Again, this is so often with the railways, it's very difficult to discern what is down to railways and what is down to other factors, and how these interact, and how you end up with the modern railway. And has the railway stimulated technological progress, or was it technological progress which enabled the railway to progress so far? my view certainly is that the railways were a great instigator of technological progress. And you only have to look at their engines, the locomotives, how quickly they changed. And interestingly, the original technology, of course, came from the UK, but very quickly, Americans developed a style of their own with their bulbous chimneys, their cow catchers or cow killers, as I call them in the book, and so on. So the American railways were more powerful, bigger than those in the UK, but oddly enough, mostly ran on the 4-foot 8.5 gauge, not entirely, but mostly. Next, we have really the way that America developed. Think of America without the railways. It was lots of small towns, pretty much discrete from one another. People really went about their business. They had small villages, small towns where, you know, you had they did so much of their own work. The cobbler, you know, often they would make their own shoes. They would kind of make their own implements for farm material and so on. And that was a view that was actually disturbed by the railways, that this kind of rural America was completely undermined. There were two kind of different views, a kind of Jeffersonian view and the Hamiltonian view of it. And the Jeffersonian view was very much like, let's kind of have little local railways that run into local market town and prosper from there. And then we have the other view where let's have big interstate railways like the Erie or the New York or the Pennsylvania across much of the country, and eventually, of course, right across the country. And of course, that view prevailed. And it upset the whole nature of American society. Next, we have the Civil War. The American Civil War is very interesting for a railway historian like me, not least because it was not only the first railway war, it was the first war in which both sides were very dependent on the railways to supply them with both their material to bring troops to the front and so on. But it was also won by the side with the better railways and the better organization of the railway. There's a guy called Herman Haupt, who was really the first person to realize the importance of railways in warfare. And he set out certain rules about how the railways should operate. He built some railways in the time, destroyed some other railways. Sorry, my screen, but I'm still there, aren't I? The screen's gone shared. And he kind of developed a whole way of operating railways in warfare, from which I wrote a book called Engines of War, and which actually survived for the next 100 years. And interestingly enough, there are even things happening in Ukraine now relating to the railways that are very relevant to the conduct of the Civil War. And of course, the Civil War, the North went in with 20,000 miles of railway, very efficient railway. The South had a very inefficient railway, very few cross-state railways, mostly running north to south. It was a pretty ramshackle affair. And what's more, in the North, they took over the railways straight away. They took control of the railways, something very important in warfare, whereas the South, the railway companies were too powerful and they were not taken over. Very interesting kind of debate about that. Sorry, I'm slightly rattling through this, conscious that I haven't got that much time. The next big one is, of course, the building of the Transcontinental Railway. And that's interesting for so many reasons. I mean, it's interesting, it's the biggest project at the time ever undertaken by America. It was also all the best of American capitalism, kind of wonderfully energetic kind of drive to create this effectively 1.5 to 2,000 mile railway from the Midwest through to the Californian coast. And it was a fantastic enterprise. And then on the other hand, it was all the worst about America. It was corrupt. There's huge amounts of government money kind of got purloined. It completely ignored the Native Americans. It kind of required actually large amounts of immigrant labor to be built. So it had kind of all, the story of the Transcontinental is fascinating for Americans precisely because it encompasses so many different aspects of it. The next is the very creation of the capitalist structure that we know. Think again of this. Before the railroads, there really were no huge enterprises. There were some shipping enterprises and there's some manufacturing, some factories and so on. But no company had to cope with running operations that might stretch 4, 5, even 1,000 miles across, maintaining a workforce that turned up at work every day to ensure that the thing ran, eventually operating telecommunications, telegraph systems that kind of went across that, creating management systems involving an absolute vast amount of stock, running transport of goods, transport of people, maintaining the locomotives and so on. It was a huge enterprise. And so eventually, post-Bellum, the companies that emerged were essentially the biggest companies in the world. And they overtook the British similar companies that had been until then the biggest companies in the world. And so they developed kind of management systems, operating systems that would then translate into the wider economy. So it was the railways that essentially established the corporation and were responsible for the massive economic takeoff that took place after the Civil War. And here's my favorite statistic. That enterprise of both a lot of very big railroad companies and a lot of small ones, mom and pop companies, but a combination of both, that gradually the smaller ones got more and more taken over, but built 254,000 miles of railway by 1914, or 1916, in fact. And if you work that out at a daily rate, that's 8 miles every day. So 8 miles every day of railroad were open between 1830 and 1916. And it just just seems an unbelievable statistic, so much so I always check it before I talk about it. But the fact that all this activity, 3,000 miles of railroad was open every year in that period, because there were some periods where, of course, a lot more were built. But it just represented such an enormous investment of both human and financial capital that it was responsible for the economic takeoff. And I'm sure Robert will kind of talk about that in more detail. So to run through just the last 3 or 4 points quickly, the next one is immigration. Again, the settlement of the West was enabled by the railways. The railroad companies actually went to places like Sweden and Italy and attracted immigrants, saying, "Come over to the country. We'll give you a cheap rail ticket," on the expectation that once these people established themselves in the West, they would then use the local railroad and whatever. So they helped to attract. Of course, they didn't do it all, but they helped to attract immigration. They also, as in the UK. The existence of railways were the stimulation to create labor unions. And again, that was an obvious thing. The railroad companies were the biggest companies. They also had large numbers of people working in the same place. And it was a natural way for natural place for unions to emerge. And last 2 points, because I'm running out of time. Last 2 points is that they were also responsible, I think, for national sport. That is a very interesting point that while there were the railroads and no aeroplanes, the baseball leagues kind of basically stopped at St. Louis or Chicago because people couldn't get further in an overnight train. And so the baseball teams would travel by overnight train to as far west as they could go from New York, and that would be the Midwest. And it wasn't until we got aeroplanes that they could fly across the country, and you'd get kind of national sports like baseball and football. And just finally, I'll end on the negative. One of the sad things about America is that it didn't retain as much railway as it could have done. Of course, 250,000 miles of railroad was too much. It has 100,000 now, and that is largely a freight railway. And the rush to leave the passenger market in the 1950s, and I'm sure Thomas will talk about this, was a big mistake. That much more of the rail network could have been preserved for passenger use if there had been the imperative to do it. And so, in a way, America kind of lost out. It has a Amtrak kind of on the East Coast, and it has these funny Amtrak trains which go around the country, but which don't really represent a passenger service. But it lost out on that. It has a wonderful freight service, of course, and very prosperous and absolutely fundamental to the present economics of America. But it lost out on its passenger railway. So I think that's a quick runaround of why the railways were important for America in the 19th and 20th century.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much. And we will now switch back to Professor Gallimore.
Oh, Gallimore.
Gallimore, yes, I beg your pardon.
No problem. Well, I think this order is better than it would have been otherwise, because the material that Christian presented is the kind of the original story of the railroads and why we got to where we were at the beginning of the 19th century. And I would take that another century to the 20th and talk in this presentation about the what I call the top 10 railroad innovations of the 20th century. Now, are you able to see what's on the screen?
Yes, top 10 railroad innovations of the 20th century.
Good. Good. Okay, so I can proceed through this presentation if I hit the right button. Now, I don't know how to get back to it. I rehearsed all of this, and it just isn't happening the way I'd hoped, but maybe we'll be able to do it. So that's my book, and on which much of this is based. I took out one section that I had written and presented when I was trying to think through, just as Christian was saying, what are the most important innovations of the 20th century? And I did then back up to what was a predecessor of that. And what I wanted to answer is a question of, are railroads old technology? Well, yes, they are, 200 years old plus, 230. So have they outlived their economic usefulness, though? No, by no means. Is railroad technology inherently inferior to newer modes? No. Have they lost out because of government favoritism to the other modes, that is, subsidy to the other modes? And I say that in part that is true. But part of it also is the fact that the railroads did not manage themselves as well as they might have. And they had a number of misdirections, failed marketing strategies, and so on. Now, this is going to be a little harder to see because I can't seem to get the sizing quite right here. Christian mentioned the initial response to the innovation of railroads was fine, all of these savings in time of travel and cheaper shipment of goods, but there was quite a negative reaction from the progressives of the area, the so-called muckrakers. And in fact, one of them described the railroad as the railroad industry as the octopus. And I think you can see, if you can see back here, I have opened the book to that page where there is in fact a cartoon of an octopus swallowing up all commerce and strangling persons who happen to get in the railroad's way as they tried to perfect a monopoly on land transportation. Congress did indeed see the danger of railroads operating as such a fictional octopus, but they came up with, in their search for a remedy, they came up with something that in effect was just as bad. ICC regulation. The history of the railroads under regulation is pretty dismal. It became a nightmare in terms of what the government policy had turned over to the ICC to regulate. And that, I call it something other than an octopus, something that in fact suffocated the initiative in the railroad industry and prevented it from being as effective as it could. The initial idea of regulation was that it would be done by state railroad commissions. Those turned out to be unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause, the Supreme Court ruling that the states could regulate rates on their own territory, but could not regulate rates outside of their borders because only the federal government could do that. And so in the Wabash decision of 1886, Congress had to declare that all regulation would be done through the Interstate Commerce Commission, and only it could enforce just and reasonable rates. The just and reasonable rates was the statutory determination of what regulators should try to accomplish. It was finally became embedded in something called value of service rate making, approved by the ICC, but never really very successful because the rate tables on which it was based could not keep up with developments in other modes. So once the invention of internal combustion engines, the development of the trucking industry, the development of highways, particularly the interstate highways, after President Eisenhower sponsored the development of them, then the ability of the ICC to regulate rates on an interstate basis fair to all comers just became almost impossible, suffocating, I argue. And one of the things that was suffocated was initiative, invention, innovations in the industry. All of that continued until finally the Staggers Rail Act of 1980 was passed in the Carter administration, and that changed everything. Before railroads had to go to the ICC for permission to do anything in the way of new initiatives. After the Staggers Act, that was changed so that private contracts between railroads and their shippers could establish rates. And that loosening of regulation was the reason, I claim, that railroads were able to regain their momentum after 1980 and became, instead of a drain on the public, a drain on subsidy, which might have happened, and became instead a profitable mainstay industry of the American economy, which it is to this day. So all of the innovation that was embedded in these cost-saving measures made possible by innovations through contracts under the Staggers Rail Act became the salvation, if you will, of the industry. So now returning to the theme that has been laid out for us, the core components of the railroad industry and how they came to successfully become transcontinental railroads, and who were some of the leaders of the industry that brought about those changes, I try to summarize in this slide. So I asked the question, what is a railroad? And I go back to the 5 core components of railroading. You must have a locomotive or some form of external power to operate the train, to power the train. You must have infrastructure in the form of tracks and bridges. Third, you must have conveyances, passenger cars, rolling stock, or in the case of passengers, passenger equipment that can be, in the fourth thing, entrained by means of what became a trademark of US railroads, the Janney couplers, also called knuckle couplers, as opposed to the European technology, which was the bumper ramps, squeezing together and then hooking with a pin, which was a dangerous procedure in any event and far less flexible and economically successful than the Janney coupler. So entrainment, it was the 4th core component of railroad service. Finally, that moving train had to be controlled. First with brakes, then with signaling systems that enforced the brakes or allowed them to be controlled from a central authority. So signaling, braking, network operating centers came later, all made possible the supervision of railroads over a broader network. And some of the key inventors that made contributions of this sort to make the industry successful, I list on this chart, and I'll make that available if it's impossible to read. But I'll just mention a couple of the pioneers here. I'm going to focus on diesel engines in just a minute, but that's a key improvement over the old steam locomotives. And of course, the rail fan community loves their steam engines, but they really weren't that efficient, not that easy to operate, certainly, and required a great deal of manpower to operate. That had to change, and the mechanism for that change was the diesel-electric hybrid locomotive, which was designed in principle by a gentleman named Herman Lemp, and the electromotive division at General Motors. So both generals got involved in this. The Eli Janney knuckle coupler was what enabled train switching to be handled much more safely, much more efficiently, with the development of things like hump yards, and also to be controlled with the development of the braking systems, network operating centers that I mentioned. Because of signaling improvements, by a couple of my favorites in the pioneers of railroading. William Robinson, who invented the DC track circuit, which can detect the presence of a train in a circuit, and George Westinghouse, who invented the air brake system, which is organized on a fail-safe method. That is to say, if the Janney couplers are broken and the train comes apart, it will stop because of the stored pneumatic power in the brake line, a system that was developed and arranged by George Westinghouse. And that, of course, enabled these American railroads. I like Christian's discussion of differences between European, United Kingdom operating methods and what happened here in the United States because of the widespread development of the railroad network and its power with the adaptation of the diesel locomotive and its signaling system, which and its use of such things as steel rail and knuckle couplers, enabling the development of a nationwide industry with its massive benefits. I'm going to skip over these top 10. What I sought here to do in this chart was to list the most important railroad innovations of the 19th century, and we've talked about some of those, and then go on to the 20th century. And I'm going to do this very quickly in David Letterman style, starting with number 10. So 10 top inventions of the 20th century for the invention or the improvement and diffusion of railroads. Number 10, railroad signaling. This is to protect the crossing from collisions. And the reason I have this in my list, you might not think of it as such an important innovation for the development of railroads, but without it, you were really condemning a lot of people to their demise at grade crossings. We call them level crossings in Britain. And the use of these devices, the improvement of them saved lots of lives. And again, it wasn't that long ago that this was the #1 cause of deaths in the railroad environment, the collisions at highway grade crossings. And after reviewing some of the key improvements in making crossings safer, I conclude with the notion that the best way of doing that, the best safety strategy for grade crossings is to eliminate them, eliminate grade crossings altogether. We did that in many cases with the interstate highway systems. They were separated into their own interstate highway system network, which had very few conflicts with railroad crossings. And that was an enormous benefit to the economy and to the safety of railroad operations. Moving on through my top 10 here, the next one is the use of hump yards and other classification schemes to speed the sorting of cars. And all of this becoming more remotely operated with a lot less rail labor and a lot less one-on-one connection of railroad workers putting themselves at risk by operating trains in what were dangerous situations. That's a long story. I won't spend any more time on it now, but you can understand the ability to operate with labor-saving devices in a dangerous environment is good for the economy. Number 8, I have listed as the use of microprocessors in control of railroad operations. That can take on a myriad of computerized processes, microprocessor control, which have led to fuel savings in the locomotive environment, the microprocessor applications in wayside signaling, making them more reliable and making them more able to carry the capacity needs of the industry. Number 7, freight car scheduling. This will be a surprise to some people, I think, not even having heard much, if anything, about freight car scheduling. It was an ingenious system developed by the Missouri Pacific with some funding assistance from the Federal Railroad Administration. It enabled computerization of car accounting and event reporting. It saved a great deal of clerical labor. It improved the accuracy of bills and so on. And it had certain direct safety benefits as well. Number 6 on my list is welded rail and premium track work. The development of better track work materials. What do I show here is the use of an iron or steel joint bar to hold 2 strings of rail together. We've now gone beyond that. We weld rail into long strings that can be assembled in the field, and the benefits are huge for the industry and for the reduction of derailments, a general benefit. Centralized traffic control. This is really a continuation of improvements in the control from traffic centers of the operation of the railroad by the use of electronic signaling and so on. It did allow a reduction of tracks, so this is one of the downsides mentioned by Christian, that yes, because we got so much better at managing and marshaling trains, the industry decided to take some of their benefits out in the form of streamlined operations, and they took a lot of the double track that had been necessary for capacity and made single track out of it. They sort of cannibalized their own systems. Number 4 in my list is roller bearings and seal joints. Again, a huge improvement in the ability of railroads to haul very heavy loads over tough terrain, around curves as necessary, and doing it without the hot boxes that were endemic in the railroad industry until its improvement of the roller bearing is shown in this illustration. Wireless radio applications invented a complex set of strategies and inventions. Clear voice communications on trains, of course. These added safety and efficiency to the older systems of telegraph, train orders, hand signals, whistle signals, and so on. And they're still evolving into computerized digital onboard information systems. Number 2, I think this is not going to be controversial. 10 years ago, might have been. 20 years ago, for sure would have been. The movement toward containerized movement of freight, really the key development was the genius of Malcolm McLean to insist that cargoes could be put into containers that could be separately put on trains and removed. That led to what we now have, our unit trains of intermodal containers. This is kind of the outcome that was facilitated, yes, by transcontinental railroads, and yes, by powerful locomotives, but it required this one particular innovation about which there was a great deal of skepticism 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago. But it's become true, and it's changed the railroad into something far different than what it was before. So what's number one? David would say, David Letterman. The diesel electric locomotive, I give the prize for the most important innovation of the 20th century because it was so ubiquitous, became so ubiquitous, had so many different benefits ranging from elimination of coal cars, or coal towers for loading coal tenders on the train, and replacing all of that infrastructure, all of that manpower with a more modern technology. And in fact, it's the one that benefits our chief competitor, the trucks, as well. That is to say, the improvements in the internal combustion engine. So number one, I say the most important innovation of our 20th century railroads is the development of the diesel electric locomotive. So here are a few of the benefits of that technology as applied in the railroad industry. It enables better adhesion of the locomotive wheels to rails. It enables reduction in infrastructure of all kinds, water towers, coal chutes, roundhouse repairs, labor cost savings, enabled the movement toward the two-person crew for today's trains, contrasted with five-person crews a century ago. And it provides a better living environment for the operators of the trains. The cab of a locomotive today is quite a marvel compared with the really tough working conditions of its predecessor. I'm going to hold this for any questions or for the follow-up discussion at the end. I did do some thinking about what might be the right environment to stimulate research and development, other technology investments in the industry. And you'll see these slides. I came up with a matrix that I think is a good way of looking at it, because it's not the individual inventions themselves, which might be implemented on a standalone basis, but also the fact that many of the improvements to the industry have come as a result of the network implementation. So what I'm arguing for in this part of my work is to say there are geographic integration benefits and there are specific benefits for reducing costs and for enhancing railroad revenues. And it's the combination of them all that is what makes our industry as valuable and as productive and as forward-looking as it is today. I'll stop at that point and let you have the mic back.
Thank you. Mr. Cornet.
Hi there. Well, I want to thank you for, let me get my slides going here. And I want to thank the association for inviting me. It's an honor to speak here. And let's see, click that. And presentation.
In there.
Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So I want to thank you for inviting me. This is an esteemed panel, and I'm absolutely thrilled and overblown to be a part of it. My personal perspective on this goes back a long time. I was a history student at the University of Michigan about 20 or so years ago, and I got a degree in history and sociology. Later, I got a degree in urban planning from the University of Illinois. And when I was a history student, and even before then, I was really interested in railroads and wanting to study the history of railroads. But also to not just for the study of it, but to make railroads better in the present and in the future. And that's what inspired me to pursue an urban planning degree. And after getting that degree, I've had the opportunity to work for a number of transit agencies, commuter railroads, and also for Amtrak, where I worked as principal officer infrastructure planning for the West for a period of time. So my perspective on the prompt and the topic is informed by both my own historical studies, but also my professional experience. And I want to bring you kind of an insight on Amtrak, which some of you in the audience, if you know about it, you might have very defined feelings about it. You might think that Amtrak is very, very good, or you might think that Amtrak is very, very bad. And I want to offer you a data-driven perspective on Amtrak. So first, we'll talk about what Amtrak is, which is something that, believe it or not, trips up a lot of people in Amtrak and others who work with Amtrak. Then I'll talk about passenger miles and look at some interesting data for that. We'll look then at Amtrak's current ridership, its funding, and issues about transparency, and why that creates some problems for historians. Something I wanted to bring forward is that with Amtrak, it's this interesting public-private chimera. It's a hybrid. And there was a case a couple of years ago about Amtrak's ability to set its own on-time performance standards and enforce that with railroads. And the final decision on that came from the US Supreme Court. And it had this very important sentence in there. I think that is missed by many. And it's by Chief Justice Alito. This case on its face may seem to involve technical issues, but in discussing trains, tracks, metrics, and standards, a vital constitutional principle must not be forgotten. Liberty requires accountability. So what is Amtrak? So when we talk about innovation, one of the innovations that Amtrak brings is that it is an entity it's a private corporation created by Congress. It's not the only one. If you pay a mortgage, you might be familiar with Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. The US Post Office, as it exists now, was created to create a federal government corporation to take over what was the Post Office Department. And this was something that the Congress in the late 1960s and through the mid 1970s, it was a tool of using federal government corporations to perform certain tasks that otherwise they didn't want to turn into a formal federal government department. So when Congress created Amtrak, it said that it shall be a for-profit corporation, and it will not be an agency or establishment of the US government. But Congress also gave Amtrak a mandate to access the nation's freight railroads. And down here, you can see a quote from another judge saying, what is Amtrak? Is it a private entity or is it part of the government? It's a real fundamental question, and it's one that we'll be talking about more. So when we look at Amtrak's routes, Amtrak, in terms of the track that Amtrak operates over, it operates 21,400 route miles. However, only 3% of that it actually owns all the way down to the soil and all the track. The rest of it operates using its vested rights to operate over the freight railroads that are privately owned. And it's a point of contention. It's a point of active litigation even today. And if anyone is in the audience is interested in the specific history of routes, I recommend this recent book, 50 Years of Amtrak Trains. It goes through all the routes that Amtrak has operated, looking at their train service, the types of trains they operated. It's a really excellent resource to start to get into the detail. But here's a graph that I wanted to show looking at passenger miles from 1900 to 2020. And in putting this together, I was really inspired by some of Dr. Gallimore's graphs that I saw at his lectures at Northwestern's Sandhouse group about 15 years ago. I used to take trips up to from University of Illinois up to Evanston to see talks there. And Dr. Gallimore has some amazing graphs, and many of which are in his book, American Railroads, that are really worth checking out. But with this graphic, what I wanted to show is, let's see if we can bring up here a pointer. So when we think of when America turned away from passenger trains, we often think of that happening in the 1950s. But really the big change started to happen in 1920, right over here. And we can see that this is a year-over-year percent change, reflecting the data shown here in passenger miles. And passenger miles, I'm using that versus numbers of trips, because this is a way to harmonize between short distance trips that there's a lot of in major cities, especially in the Northeast, and longer distance trips that are across the rest of the country. In the 1920s, there was a loss of passengers on routes in rural America, branch lines, lighter used passenger services, as people started to buy cars. And at this time, it would have been the Model T. And even on those primitive roads, automobility opened up more opportunities. And then in the 1930s, it really turned into a crisis with the Great Depression as ridership really, really fell off. But railroads didn't disinvest from passenger service. They really thought that they could win the passengers back with new equipment. They kept buying new equipment in the 1920s. In the 1930s, they made a big move toward energy conservation, one that's not unlike moves toward energy conservation today in other parts of the world. And all of that innovation in the 20s and 30s meant that America was ready for World War II. So when we see this big spike in passenger miles during World War II, which much of it is attributable to troop trains from going from one end of the country to the other, but also a gas rationing that meant that using a private automobile for most trips wasn't available, that the nation's railroads were ready for World War II. After World War II, they really thought that they could retain many of these passengers, that the Depression was over, that there was a new opportunity for growth. And in the 1950s, they bought a number of streamlined passenger trains, passenger cars. But we can see here that in the 1950s, passengers continued to fall off. And the crossover between air and rail passenger miles occurs in 1958. And the development of new jet aircraft after that, the Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, really lowered the cost of air travel, made it more available to more people. And passenger miles continued to fall as US population continued to rise. And we get here to the beginning of Amtrak in 1970, which is almost at a low point for passenger rail miles in the history of the US. And the reason for that is not just because of loss of intercity passenger traffic, but in many cities, constraints in fares for commuting traffic meant that commuter trains had been losing money since the 1940s and even before. So it was only federal funding was only for commuter trains was only beginning in the 1970s. But as those trains around Chicago and especially around Boston and New York, a little bit in Washington, D.C., were improved, were made more relevant, commuter traffic began to improve. And what we can see is that it's not as though passenger trains are coming back, it's that they're finding a niche. And that's the big story of this chart, is that passenger rail traffic is finding a niche. The rate of growth from 1970 to 2020 is nowhere near the rate of growth of the US population. It's well below that. But in the areas where passenger trains found a niche, they became relevant and meaningful for the ways that people moved about the country before the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we look at Amtrak, this is Amtrak passenger miles from 1972 to 2020. And we can see that there has been growth. but also declines. In the 1970s, a lot of the growth was motivated by fuel price spikes. In the 1980s, there was growth with traffic on some of the long distance trains that had brand new equipment, and also some of the corridor trains that operated for states that had brand new equipment at the time. Throughout the 1990s, there were some declines in ridership, especially as Amtrak restructured its routes and cut back on many of its services. There was some recovery in the 2000s, but minimal. You can see that the growth here has been more or less in a channel. And then finally, a 50% drop with the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
So when you think of Amtrak, it's operating across the entire country. But if we break it down, where are people riding and how efficient are they riding? So one of the metrics that I use as a manager when I'm looking at passenger traffic is load factors. And what that tells me is how efficiently is a train being used on a given route. And a load factor is what it's telling me is how many of the seats that are available are actually being sold. So this is using annual data from 2019, which is the most recent normal year that we can have Amtrak data for. And we can see that the trains in the Northeast were used relatively well. 63% for the Northeast corridor, for the Acela trains, the high-speed trains in the Northeast corridor, 57% for the regional trains. And those trains in the Northeast, they have 39% of Amtrak's ridership and 32% of Amtrak's passenger miles, even though it's only 2% of Amtrak's route mileage. So it's a very intensely used part of the network. The long distance trains is a little different. So it's 14% of the ridership, 67% of the route mileage, and 37% of passenger miles. So it's much less dense in terms of service. In terms of British context, we would call many of these trains a parliamentary service in terms of operating so infrequently. But we can see with load factors is that they're actually very well used. The average load factor is almost equal to that of the Northeast corridor. Northeast corridor has 59% average load factor. Long distance is 58% average load factor. And actually the best train in Amtrak in terms of its being efficiency and being used was the Chicago to Washington, D.C. Cabin Limited at 67% load factor. Now we'll get to the state-supported trains. And these are trains that Amtrak operates with a contract to individual states or regional entities. There are 20 states or entities that are funding trains across 17 states. They have 47% of the passenger miles and 31% of the route mileage. But the average load factor is 41%. And the lowest load factor actually in the entire Amtrak system is a train that operates not too far from me, from Oakland, California to Bakersfield, at a 28% load factor, which means that almost 3/4 of the seats on that train on average are going unsold. You have these empty trains that are running on this corridor back to back. And many other trains aren't performing much better. You can see this line here shows that 50%. Most state trains are operating at less than 50% of their capacity. So let's keep that in mind and look at why this is important. And this is a text-heavy slide, but I wanted to give you this data because it helps to cut through some of the rhetoric that you'll see on both sides about Amtrak. So these state corridors are really important to Amtrak because Amtrak's accounting treats subsidies from states as earned revenue. So even though these trains are operating, many of them at less than 50% capacity, Amtrak does not have a fare box risk in operating them because of that state subsidy. So between 2009 and 2019, there was new federal legislation that standardized how Amtrak charges for states for these services. In this time, there was a 5% decline in total ridership. However, there was a 50% increase in payments across this time from states to Amtrak for these services, going from 346 million to 806.4 million. And that's because of that legislation called PRIA, the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act of 2009. And additionally, there's also capital charges that are assessed by Amtrak to states to account for account for states using Amtrak equipment and infrastructure in providing these corridor services. And it's a significant amount. It's $294 million. And those capital charges aren't factored in the fare box recovery ratios. Fare box recovery is looking at revenue compared to expenses. So not incorporating that into the fare box ratio means that the cost recovery of these services actually looks a lot better than what it really is. So I talked about Amtrak being at a turning point. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is potentially going to have more funding for Amtrak to expand these state corridors than Amtrak has received in its entire 50-year existence. Accounting for inflation, Amtrak has received $94.3 billion. And the amount authorized in this legislation can exceed that depending on appropriations. There was a great article by the Transportation Center, and the headline is, the title of the article is perfect. The expansion of these routes will depend on the willingness of states to subsidize their operation. And Amtrak wants to create 39 new state corridors across the country. And the reason it wants to do this isn't because there's phenomenal performance. It's because the fare box and the performance that Amtrak receives is guaranteed. So let's talk a bit about transparency, because ultimately, as a historian, we need evidence. And as planners, we need evidence. Amtrak has worked very hard at changing its rules about what it can disclose. Even though Amtrak is a federal government corporation, in 1972, Congress said very clearly, in light of the substantial federal funds which are going to Amtrak, the taxpayer public is entitled to access information about the conduct of Amtrak affairs. In 1997, Amtrak was given an opportunity to write its own FOIA rules, and they exempted their own business information from being disclosed through FOIA, which is a huge amount of information. It's anything that a historian or a planner would want to use. And in Amtrak's own discussion about FOIA, they say proprietary and commercial competitive Amtrak revenue information is exempt from FOIA. For Amtrak, for many of you who are interested in Amtrak, you might be aware of the Rail Passengers Association. And last year, I was on a panel discussion with the head of the Rail Passengers Association, and I've raised the issue of transparency. And what their CEO and president, Jim Matthews, said, I think is quite revealing. And here's part of the quote is, I think a lot of folks want transparency so they can find a club to beat Amtrak with. And that doesn't serve anybody. We need to improve rail service in this country. And Amtrak is one of several ways to do that. And I think this is important. Amtrak is very deliberate in terms of what it releases. And the advocates are happy to go along with it, or at least this one advocacy organization is happy to go along with it, because the ends justify the means. So I want to go back about this quote from Justice Alito that I opened with. And I think it's really important because it gets to a much bigger level beyond Amtrak as to why transparency is important for all of us. And as he said here, when citizens cannot readily identify the source of legislation or regulation that affects their lives, government officials can wield power without owning up to the consequences. One way the government can regulate without accountability is by passing off a government operation as an independent private concern. Given the incentive to regulate without saying so, everyone should pay close attention when Congress sponsors corporations that it specifically designates not to be agencies or establishments of the US government. So finally, I want to give you this quote from Oscar Hanlon. And I think it's really succinct. It's where there is no evidence, there is no history. And I have a picture here from the National Archives showing their reading room in Washington, DC, or one of their reading rooms. And for anyone who's done history, an archive is our equivalent to a laboratory. It's where we go to get the evidence. It's where our evidence is. It's the beginnings of our story of understanding what happened in the past. And really, why history is valuable is because it can help us move beyond dialectics over whether or not Amtrak is good or bad to an evidence-based understanding of how to best use the billions in funding that have been invested over the past half century. And it's clear to me that Amtrak's efforts to restrict access to its data is a deliberate obstruction to honest and impartial inquiry. So here are my notes for anyone who wants to look back at this. And I welcome any questions from anyone who is looking to delve further into the sources of my data and graphs. And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. So I have questions here. I have a query first from MA about Thomas Leiper's first railway in Pennsylvania. And I think I'll just sort of broaden that out. I know there's a question of definitions. So what makes for, when we're talking about the first railways, in America, in Britain, what is the proper definitions, plural, let's be academic, of what makes for a railway? And in fact, are the people who are not giving standard credit in the textbooks, I mean, how much is that unfair?
There's a certain, if I could jump in and start off.
For everyone, but yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Part of it is looking at the technology of having a guideway where you have wheels that are on a fixed guideway, which is really the essential technology of what a railroad is, versus having the organization and the institution to make that guideway accessible to people through offering transportation service for hire. So if we look at that guideway and having a fixed guideway, there are examples that show up in history at various times, going back to the late 18th century, especially in mining, because it was an early innovation for mines as mining began to have a fixed guideway. But later on, it's when you start to apply that to have make it available for commercial transport, that there's some debate as to who was first. And 100 years ago, this was a very active debate among railroads because they were trying to vie for whose predecessors was the first. And that discussion, that debate really started in 1922, 100 years ago.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I mean, you're right, Thomas, in that actually the idea of running wagons on tracks predates the 18th century. I've just been reading, checking really, a book about early railroads, and some of that stretches back even a bit beyond that. And there's even talk that in ancient Greece there was a track where they on a road where they kind of rolled some wagons and so on. So one could say it almost goes back to the wheel. My definition is in England, there's a very clear distinction between two early railroads. So in 1825, there was a Stockton and Darlington Railway. And that was really an extension of what were called these tramways, whereby it was partly horse drawn, it was single track, it ran between two very kind of small places. It was mainly about taking coal and other minerals to the sea or the river. And I don't define that as the first railway. In England, there's debates about this, and we're going to have big celebrations in 2025 about it. But I think the first proper railroad in the UK was the Liverpool and Manchester. Why is that? Because it ran between two major cities. It was entirely steam hauled. It took both passengers and freight, and it operated in both directions and carried a multiplicity of goods. And so I would say that was the first railroad. That's why the Baltimore and Ohio slightly wins it over the North Carolina, in that the Baltimore and Ohio did carry passengers quite quickly. It carried freight, and it kind of was a more multi-purpose than the initial runnings of the North Carolina. So, but there's amongst rail fans, there are endless discussions about this. I haven't heard of Thomas Leiper actually, so I can't help you on that one.
And Dr. Gallimore, do you have something you want to add?
No, I don't have anything more to add. I think we're all in agreement on what the essential components of the proper definition of railroads is. You have to have those things I put on the one slide, a motive power source, a track or other guideway, and so on. And then some means to control it, such as not just brakes in the short term, but control systems or network control centers over the longer term. I don't think there's much controversy there. I know that the rail fan community, you call them train enthusiasts, I think, in England.
Train spotters.
Train spotters is a very particular
or grisers.
Yeah, a very particular kind of rail fan. But they will forever debate what was first. And I think that the historians have a lot of fun going through that, the evidence on that relates to any one particular place or one particular train or the other. But that's far from my focus.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question from Vesna Radovic, thanking for a great session. Is there a future for high-speed rail in the United States? And I guess I would say, and also compared with other countries, how is our future and why?
Yeah, well, since I've been talking, I'll just keep going. This is a question that I hope Thomas weighs in on. To me, the distinction is so heavily that American railroads fit with freight and European railroads, British railroads fit so well with passengers because of the different economics provided for the market that they serve. To me, the possibilities of high-speed rail in the United States are pretty slim. I think most of the economies are already captured in the Northeast Corridor services. There might be one or two additional corridors. I know the Texans would love to have some kind of a Texas Triangle operation. But whether those are viable in the long term, that's not something I intend to weigh in on.
There was a book that came out in the early 1950s looking that's really important for transportation planning. It's called, and it looks at what its fundamental conclusion was that transportation is a function of land use. And when we look at US transportation demand, much of it is reflected in the fact that US transportation demand has reflected the desire and in America or choice to develop land around our cities. And it's very different than what you have in Western Europe and Britain, where historical relationships about landholding constrain development within cities. So you have cities that are very, very dense, where here in the States, our cities are less dense and they're surrounded by areas that, vast areas where there's a lot of single family homes, a lot of large business estates. And what that means is that the coming to a single point and taking a high-speed train to another single point, those economies don't work as well in the States as they do, for example, in Spain, where they work very, very well because they're aligned with Spain's historical land use. And the same thing, similar in Britain, where Britain's historical land use patterns has very dense cities, and there's a real demand for a network of frequent trains that connect very dense cities, and the same thing across Western Europe. So for the States, there might be a niche, maybe, but what I see, the real competition for high-speed rail isn't the auto or airlines, it's what we're doing right now, which is telecommuting. The fact that we're having this conversation from, across the world, as opposed to flying to one place, is incredibly efficient. And this is going to change business going forward. And in turn, that's going to reduce the demand for transportation on all modes considerably. And I think that's going to further diminish the economies of scale that would be needed to make high-speed rail a viable choice in the States.
Yes, I'd add that if America had retained more of its passenger rail infrastructure, and people had kept the habit of using railways. It might have been more viable to have retained, to have some high-speed lines, maybe Texas, California, which is, as I understand, still building one, but from the middle of nowhere to the middle of nowhere, which is not, Bakersfield to God knows where, is not going to be promising. Los Angeles to Las Vegas might have a market, and might be reasonably cheap to build over kind of cheap land, but there aren't many places. You have to look at the successful high-speed rail networks. The most successful is Japan, and why is that? It's because it's the reverse of what you were saying, Thomas. In America, in Japan, everybody's living on the kind of flat bit of the island, and has easy access to stations, and therefore, it's the most efficient thing to use. France has an effective network, again, because it has big urban centers, quite big distances with not much in between them. Taking a train from Marseille, which is right at the bottom of France, to Paris in 3 hours non-stop in a full train does show that the demand, which I've done in the past, it does show that there's a demand that's 500 miles, amazing kind of journey. But yes, so I think it's very limited. Where I think the America could make better use of railways is, as your graph suggests, commuter railways, boosting them, getting people out of their cars in towns and major cities, tramways, which have popped up in places around America, but it could be more intensively used. That sort of thing will, I think, have more of a future in the United States than going for the very expensive high-speed rail. I'm a skeptic about high-speed rail in the UK, where it's going to cost something like $120 billion to build this line, which I think suffers from what you say. Although that there will be some stations in the middle of urban centres, there'll be very few stations, and a lot of that will involve people driving to these stations, and it kind of negates the whole point. So I don't think that the UK's idea is great. I think there's other things to spend railroad money on. And you hint in your talk that Amtrak is going to waste quite a lot of money on kind of connecting city pairs that maybe don't have the necessary traffic. And I, despite I'm a great rail fan, I do concur with that.
Thank you. Let's see. I think we got answers from everyone. Gosh, we're actually approaching the end of our section, session time, which was going to be 3:30. I am going to therefore ask if I could just have a last little 30 seconds to a minute concluding statement from each of you. I guess reverse order. Mr. Cornet first.
I guess what I would say to anyone who's interested in railroads, either current events, historical, is to really look at the data. There's an incredible amount of data out there historically, and there's really interesting data out there on present events. And it's a way to reveal a new understanding about this industry that might be different than what you read about in the press, or might be different than what you've read about in other published histories.
Thank you. Mr. Wilmar.
As a fan of the railways, I'd just like to emphasize one important point, which is that, and Thomas raised it to some extent, which is that subsidy should not be a dirty word. That you can develop railroads or support railroads with some government money. They don't necessarily have to be commercially viable, and that's because they bring all sorts of other benefits in terms of the environment, in terms of what's called the agglomeration effect. In other words, enabling people to get to work. So don't just abandon the idea of having railroads and building new railroads and supporting railroads just because they cost money. Highways cost money as well, and nobody ever calls it subsidy.
Thank you. Dr. Gallimore.
Oh, I love the comments that you all have shared. I think the thing about subsidy for me is it distorts markets, but in the case of a developing nation like the United States was, say, 200 some years ago, why not? What did the government have? Didn't have a lot of revenues on hand, didn't have the ability to tax a great deal, but it had a lot of Western land that was free for the taking, and they gave it away to homesteaders, and they gave it away to railroad builders. Gradually, the highways caught up and matched the amount of subsidy that the federal government was willing to put into their mode. But we did pretty well with our mode in the interim. I'm skeptical about the high-speed development process. I'm skeptical about whether it will have the benefits that's expected. And I'm skeptical about the cost that it will take, that it will take for the development of those systems. But I love railroads. I love passenger railroads. I love the railroad history, and I hope it endures forever and ever.
Thank you so much. So thank you, all the participants on the panel. Thank you, the audience. We couldn't do this without you, and we do it for you. Now, I'll just say once again, some of the things I said at the beginning and a little bit more. First, if you had questions that weren't answered, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org, and I will be delighted to forward your questions to the participants so they can have the option to answer you. Then, this is going to be recorded within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Now, I also want to advertise. We have more webinars coming up. In this American Innovation webinar series, our next one is going to be the Age of the Automobile. That's on October 18th. And I will mention, we also have a Great American Novel series, and that's actually September 27th, much sooner, The Catcher in the Rye, a J.D. Salinger discussion. And indeed, on October 6th, we have Hijacked, the Capture of America's Middle East Studies Centers, which we are going to be having a launch for a National Association of Scholars report. So I'll mention that to everybody. I will put in a plug. If you enjoyed this, please consider joining the National Association of Scholars as a member. We would be delighted to have you, and we think that you might enjoy the sort of stuff we do. That's the end of the plug. Again, thank you all so much. It's been wonderful.
Good.
Thank you.